which want to have me on site as well, so it was not possible for me to be there. I'm going to talk today about testing, and yeah, maybe quickly about myself. I think probably some of you already know me if you have participated in some of the Integration Matters meetups or other meetups. For all the others, I'm Andreas Oberrauter. I'm a technical architect based out of Zurich, and yeah, I've been working mainly on the MuleSoft technology in the past 6 years. I'm going to talk today about testing. So as you probably know, testing is a quite large topic and can get also very complicated. And I would like to share a little bit my experiences on the different projects I had. I'm going to start with like a quick overview about like what we consider of functional and non-functional testing. Then I will give you some best practices on how testing can be implemented with the API-led architecture. Here in brackets, you also see, I called it now composable architecture, because this will be the new terminology and how we basically name it at the end. And then third, I will give you a quick demo about our test automation and how to do that with Karate. Before we start, two things. So testing is a very large, and as you can see here in brackets, sometimes also very complicated topic. I have seen a lot of customers which basically started with testing or wanted to start, but they basically stopped with MUnit testing and didn't get further. So it can get very complicated. Please keep in mind that in this presentation, I will not cover all aspects of testing. I also won't go into the very details of testing. I will only cover it, I would say, on a high level. And secondly, there might be some terms and definitions which might vary depending on the person you are speaking with. So there is different definition of, for example, integration testing, of system testing, and whoever you ask at the end, they're probably going to give you another definition of it. So please consider this is everything my personal opinion based on my personal project experience. All right, having said that, going into functional and non-functional testing. You see, there are a lot of white boxes here, and I tried to basically write down all types of testing which came into my mind, and there are quite a lot. Right, so I mean, you probably know unit testing, which we are doing in MuleSoft with MUnit, but there are acceptance testing, regression testing, performance testing. You can probably just keep going with a lot of different testing types. And I mean, I added a lot of boxes here as well. So there are probably, I don't know, a lot of testing types at the end. But at the end, you can probably cluster it in two different kinds of testing, the functional and the non-functional testing. The functional testing, as you probably know, is basically all kind of testing which is relevant for the business functionality or for the functional requirements. And the non-functional testing is everything else, like performance testing, usability testing, security testing, which is indirectly also targeting the functional requirements, but it's not like the main goal at the end. In this presentation, I'm only going to talk about some boxes in the functional testing area, because performance testing, etc., will be probably an entire new meetup because it can get very complex. So I decided to focus on 3 different functional testing types. And those are the unit testing, the regression testing, and the integration testing. Usually what I do on my project is I usually define, first of all, like what kind of testing types we want to implement in the project. And most of the time, M-unit testing, it's always the first thing which we do. And it's, if you look into the best practices, also one of the requirements. What I then usually do is I basically define, okay, what M-unit testing is. So we have components which we want to test within the Mule applications. Additionally to the definition, we usually define also success criteria, which you can see here in the green boxes. So for example, the unit tests need to be minimum of 85% code coverage. We need to have positive and negative testing scenarios. And for example, we need to test all of our data with components. And this is basically then the base on how we then build all our testings during the project. The second one, which I'm going also to dive into today, is the regression testing. And I defined it now in this example that regression testing is only done for synchronous integrations. We can also do it for asynchronous integrations, but it might get a little bit complicated because you don't get directly a response back, right? So in this presentation, I would like to focus only for the regression testing for the synchronous integrations. And for example, some of the success criteria could be, okay, we test all the API responses which we are getting back, as well as the HTTP codes which we are getting back of our APIs. And then the third one, the integration testing. And this is, again, it can vary in the definition, right? Some people understand of integration testing like testing end-to-end, so triggering one external system and then basically checking in the other external system if we have received the data accordingly. In my example, I only have integration testing for multiple systems, but not for the entire end-to-end integration. End-to-end integration would be for me, for example, user acceptance tests or end-to-end integration tests. I defined here the integration testing basically of testing the integration layer with multiple systems. And some success criteria here could be that we basically test the connectivity to the external systems or to the integrated systems. And we also test some kind of the business requirements or the functional flows, which are part of an integration, but we could also mock some of the systems because there don't have to be all of them involved, but maybe we can have some of the external systems connected and some of them are mocked. As soon as I define the different testing types, and as you can imagine, there can be like even more, right? If you want to do performance tests, if you want to do, I don't know, even other tests, you basically just add the different boxes with the success criteria, and then you take all those testing types as a base for your integration landscape. As soon as I define those testings, I basically try to think on how are we then going to implement those testing types into our composable architecture or API-led architecture. Because there can be like different options on how you do testing at the end, because we have those three different layers, right? And there are always questions, yeah, do I have to trigger the experience API? Do I have to trigger the process or the system API or even all of them? And I try to always define on what we really understand of this integration testing type at the end. So what I usually take as a base are always the patterns which we use in order to design our integrations. In this example here, I choose only two patterns. So I have the synchronous integrations on the left-hand side. Yeah, I saw those bubbles going up. Somehow a Microsoft Teams feature. So on the left side, we have all those synchronous integrations, which are basically just request response. And on the right side, I have an example of asynchronous integrations. If we start first with the synchronous integrations, you already know there are different options how we can design them. I took two for this example, which is one experience and one system API. So if system A triggers the experience API, we are then getting back the response through the system API, and system B back to system A. We also can have a synchronous integration with all the three layers, obviously, but it doesn't need always to be like that, right? If you don't need the process layer, you don't have to put it into the architecture. And then on the right-hand side, we have an asynchronous integration where I have a topic or a queue in between of the experience and the system API. This can also be defined differently, right? So you could have a process API listening to the topic or a system API. I just defined in this architecture that I have an experience and a system API. What I do then is I take those two patterns, and then I try to map those patterns to the different testing types which I defined before. Like, how am I going to do MUnit tests for those two patterns? How am I going to do integration tests for those two patterns? And how am I going to do integration tests for those two patterns? If we start with the MUnit tests, you see here I included the synchronous as well as the asynchronous integrations into the same picture, because at the end with MUnit tests, we are just testing the applications itself, right? Most of the time. So we basically write the MUnit tests for the experience, for the process, and for the system API, and we are then, based on the criteria which we defined before, testing the data weaves, the different components, some kind of logic within the Mule application itself. And those are the unit tests which we then defined in the beginning. Now let's look into the regression tests. And as you can see already in the title, I only defined it now for the synchronous integrations, because for the asynchronous, it will be a little bit more complicated. I don't want to dive into it in this presentation. But yeah, maybe we can have another session or so about it, or also speak about it after the presentation. For the regression tests, for the synchronous integrations, you see here again, I have all the three layers, could be also only two. And I have my testing script or testing tool or whatever we use here in this yellow box, which can either trigger my experience API, then get back the response, trigger the process API, or even trigger the system API, right? And if we run regression tests, we basically want to check if we haven't broken something with the new features which we are releasing. So I always find it very useful to run all the regression tests as soon as we deploy it to a certain environment. And then we basically trigger experience, process, and system API, and we check the responses and the status quotes which we are getting back in order to make sure that we haven't broken anything. And as stated here on the right-hand side, this can be either be done manually with like HTTP clients such as Postman or whatever you are using, but it could also be done automated. And I will get into this then in the third part with Karate Labs. And now let's have a look into the last one, so the integration tests. And now I also did it again for the synchronous and the asynchronous integrations. You see here on the left-hand side, again, one of the patterns which we have defined. And now there are two different kind of options on how we can basically trigger those integration tests. The first box is option A. So what we do in this case is we trigger our experience API. With the experience API, publish the message into the queue or the topic. And this will be then asynchronously processed to the system B, right? So what we can do in this integration test is basically check the response which we are getting back from the topic or from the queue, but we also need to check then somehow on the external system if the messages have arrived as we expected, right? And this can be done, I mean, manually, obviously, and that's also most of the time what we do in the beginning of a project. So we trigger somehow the experience, and then we check in the external system again if it has arrived accordingly. This can be also done automated, but it's not that easy because you actually don't know when this message is processed, right? So you need to have some kind of a script which is then also polling or somehow receiving an event from the system that the message has arrived in order to check against whatever you are expecting at the end. And then the second option would, for example, be we can also skip this experience API and directly put or publish a message directly into the queue and the topic. And then we check again in this system, in this external system, if the message has arrived or not, and we check then the payload accordingly. And as you can imagine, there are a lot of different flavors, right, on how you can do those integration tests. And I think one of the most important things is that you basically define it like this. So you trigger either experience or the queue, and then you basically use this one for all the integration tests which you are using or which you are doing, so that everybody is then aligned of what an integration test is at the end. Now, if we talk about test automation, so in this case, I mean, we defined the different patterns, we defined the integration types which we want to do. And the first thing which I always start with is manual testing, right? Because manual testing is pragmatic, manual testing can be somehow done, and it still basically ensures that you have a certain quality in your integrations. But at some point, you might think about test automation as well. So basically everything which we are doing manually, we want to do automated, right? And I had quite a lot of customers, to be honest, which directly want us to start with test automation. But please keep always in mind, as stated here at the top, test automation can get very complicated. Because as soon as you start thinking about all the details of what like test automation includes, there are a lot of questions which you need to answer before you can even start, right? And in my opinion, it's always a trade-off. So do you really want to spend time in writing all those tests or those automated tests? Or does it make more sense to maybe spend a little bit more time in the manual tests rather than creating a lot of testing scripts, which are maybe even getting constantly broken, or you don't even have the right setup? So I think in the beginning, manual tests make absolutely sense to be very pragmatic. And then at some point, including automated tests makes also sense, but it's always a question of the trade-off at the end. And I wrote down here some, I would say, challenges or considerations which you need to think about as soon as you start with automated testing. So one of the most asked questions is like, what first, it's quite a simple question. What kind of testing tool are we going to use? And I just put a few examples here on the right-hand side, but I saw a lot of customers evaluating a lot of testing tools, spending quite a lot of time into this topic. And it's not very easy to answer, right? Because ideally, you want to have a testing tool where you can not only use for your APIs, which you can even use for all the other applications as well, right? So you need to somehow choose, okay, the right testing tool. Then second questions, when do we run those automated tests? Is it after we deploy to UAT? Do we run the tests after even deploying to production because we want to do some smoke tests regarding the connectivity? Or when do we want to run them at the end, right? So there is a lot of thinking behind that as well. The third question, if we set up all those automated tests, will it be like a centralized repository where we basically include all those automated tests? Or are we going to put all the automated tests in the different Mule applications? Also a good question to ask, because there are always pros and cons regarding that. Do we even have access to the external systems? Because if we run automated tests, we somehow need to check on the external systems if the data has arrived accordingly. And do we even have access to those external systems to basically check automatically if the data has arrived? If we talk about automated performance tests, do we even have the provisioning of the infrastructure? Because we want to run our performance tests on an infrastructure which is similar to our prod infrastructure, and those can be quite expensive. So we need to have somehow a setup of our automated tests. We need to have the different test scenarios. And ideally, we also tear everything down again, because we don't want to have this infrastructure always running. So those are just like a few questions or considerations which you need to think about as soon as you start with test automation. It can be done, but keep in mind it can get very complicated. Now, talking about test automation, I would like now to go into the demo with Karate Labs. I used Karate Labs in the last year on one of my projects, and I was actually quite surprised how good it is to somehow automate some tests. I'm quickly. I don't know if I can ask you guys questions. I don't know if you can even answer it. But are there some people in the room who used already Karate Labs in order to do some kind of test automation?
I see no hands raised, so
Okay.
I don't think anyone has used it already.
Okay, cool.
One hand was raised.
Oh, nice. Good. So with Karate Labs, you should be able to see now Visual Studio Code, right?
No, we only see the browser right now.
Okay, let me quickly share my other screen. Now you should see Visual Studio Code. Is it big enough?
I think, yeah, it's big enough.
All right. So Karate Labs, just give you a very quick intro about it. It started as an open source automation platform. It's not fully open source anymore. There are a few features where you need to pay for it, but I would say still 90% is still open source. And you can just like pull all the Git repositories of them in order to build your tests. So what I have done is I have here my test project. And you can decide at the end with Karate Labs if you basically want to build multiple tests in each of your Mule applications, or if you want to have a centralized repository which include all of your test scripts, and you then basically run it from there. In my demo, I have decided to put all my automated tests into the same project. What is this Karate project at the end? This Karate project, as you can see here, it's basically a Java project. So we also have a POM file in there, and it can be built with Maven. There is one folder which is called APIs. And in this API folder, I put all of my APIs which I have at the moment in my landscape. And you can see here, I only have two system APIs. One, it's called JSON placeholder. So it's making calls to this mock service in the background. And the other one, it's called system API for the Pokemon API. So it's basically making calls to the Pokemon mocking service in the background. If you have more process experience, whatever APIs, that's basically the place where you are going to create all those folders. Additionally to that, I have environment properties for dev prod UAT. So I can basically tell the Karate labs if I want to run it on dev environment, on production, or UAT environment. And based on that, I'm going to specify just different properties in those files. This is the basic structure of how basically this Karate projects looks like. And in order to execute it at the end, we have this parallel API parallel test, which is called runner in Karate Labs. So what it does at the end is, and I just copied it from the GitHub repository from Karate Labs, it sets up multiple threads. So in my case, 5 threads, and then it's basically executing all of my scripts in parallel with 5 threads. You can also do it sequentially if you want. I decided to run everything in parallel because it's a little bit faster. So now, how does those tests look like? We have now this system API placeholder, and I'm going to open this up now. And what you can see in here are all my different data entities. And this is then up to you on how you want to create it at the end. So you can do it based on data entities, you can do it based on domains, or whatever you decide to at the end, even based on use cases if you want. So in this example, I have 3 data entities: albums, posts, and users. And I also have one folder, which is just my health check endpoint, which is checking if the API is up and running. If I drill now in this album folder, you see I have all my testing scripts inside this folder. So I have my examples in here. So the album.json, and if I open this up, you see this is just like an example of how the response looks like for an album, and also for multiple albums, which is at the end an array. So I place all the examples and also the script which I'm running at the end in the same folder. The most important part of this Karate script are everything which is ending with feature. As soon as you call something .feature, it will be automatically recognized by Karate that those are the testing scripts which we want to run at the end. So even though this is like a Java project and application at the end, you can see all this, the tests which we are writing are very descriptive. So the main goal is not that only developers can write those tests, that also maybe some not very technical people could write tests. And if you just read it here, it's very descriptive, right? So we have a scenario, for example, retrieve all albums for a given path. We send the header, client ID, and secret. We do a get, and then we basically check, is the status 200? Does it match a JSON response, and does it match our object, which is lying in the same folder? And this is how you basically write at the end all those Karate tests. And there are a lot of libraries and a lot of functionalities which you have in order to test your payload, even to test asynchronous flows. So you can basically wait for a certain time and then check if, for example, a message has been published. If you write all those tests, it's based on a feature. So this is always the first thing you need to define. In my case, a feature is an album. Then you have the background, which is basically setting up the entire test with like, what is the base URL we are using? Maybe set also some variables which we want to use during our tests. And then we execute the tests within those scenarios. And we also validate it against any kind of condition. And this is then done basically in all the different tests which we have, right? For the health check, for the posts, and even for the other API, so the Pokemon system API, which we have. And it's exactly set up the same way. So now let's execute one of the tests. So I have now this entire folder with the 2 APIs, and I'm now going to run Maven. And it's a very simple command. So I do Maven test. I use my runner, which are all the parallel tests. I'm going to also pass client ID and secret. I don't need it at the moment because the APIs are open, but that's where you basically would add it. And then I basically say I'm going to run the tests on the dev environment. If I run this now, what you see, it's going to build the project. And it's going to use the 5 threads in order to execute all the tests in the back. So you can already see it in the logs. It's making some gets to the Pokemon API. It's getting back some payloads. And at the very end, there was now a failure. So probably one of the tests failed. But all the tests have been now executed. So now the nice thing of Karate is that if we go now into the folder, it creates out of the box reports for us, which are now in HTML. So if I want to check, for example, all our features which we executed, I open up this feature dashboard, and it's based on Cucumber. And what we can see now here is all the APIs which we executed. So for example, the system API placeholder, the system API for Pokemon with all our features, and also if all the features have been executed successfully or not. And you can see here that, I mean, most of our features were okay, but we had one failure, which was the Pokemon feature, where it's basically showing red, and at the end it failed. So now what we want to do is basically investigate on what went wrong here. So we can click into this Pokemon feature, and it will show you all the different steps which we are executing as part of our feature. So we can see here it executed the endpoint at the end. It's green. It got back the status 200. It's also green. It got back a JSON response, which is also green, but it didn't match with the Dito object, which I added into my test, right? So it even tells you, okay, the match failed somehow, and the payload which we received, it's not the payload which we expected at the end. And now we can go back into our application and maybe fix our payloads because we saw that somehow something went wrong here. And what we did on my last project, which was really nice, we wrote for all our get operations because it's easier to start with the get, all those Karate tests. And every time when we release the feature, we just run all the tests in order to do some kind of a regression test. And if something of the test fails, we knew, okay, something went wrong or we somehow implemented a bug or so. Now, one last thing which I wanted to show you is we have now the list based on the different features. And there might be cases where we only want to test some of the APIs, or we want to test only some of the domains, right? Because we have an experience, process, and system API, and we basically want to test this use case and not testing all of the APIs. So Karate has a nice feature where you can add tags, and you see those with this @ sign here, where you can add tags to the different testing scenarios. So I added to this one that this testing scenario is part of our system API, and it's also part of the use case JSON placeholder. You can add all those tags to all the different tests you are running. And at the end, you have the flexibility to only execute as part of Maven a few of those tags. And how this looks like at the end is if I now open up the Cucumber report for the tags, it shows you following. You see that, for example, all the health check endpoints are part of the health check tag. And now you see that everything went well, at least for the health check. You also see that, for example, my Pokemon domain went well, my JSON placeholder went well. So at the moment, everything passed. And I think I didn't add a tag for my failed scenario, but you would see the failed scenario also here if it would be part of a tag. And the nice thing is it gives you the full flexibility to just run a few tests for your APIs or for your domains or even for your use cases, because it might be the case that you don't want to run all of the tests at the end. Yeah, and this was basically what we did. And they also use now Karate for even the async integrations, and they extended it for posts and patches as well. And yeah, in my opinion, it was a really nice tool to basically start with this entire test automation, very small with only the get, but having the possibility to extend it in whatever direction you want at the end. All right. Sorry, I think it took 7 minutes longer than I expected. Thank you very much for having me, and I think we can open up now for questions.
Yeah, thank you for the talk first. Really nice. Does anyone have some questions? Yes. Well, I'm just